Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my Worlds 2022 semifinals predictions video. Now, I've already made a full bracket prediction, as I think a lot of loyal people to the channel will have known. I did that at the beginning of the quarterfinals, but the semifinals shook out in a pretty interesting way, and I'm going to be going over the specific matchups that we're going to be seeing here in the semifinals. 1 and 2, we'll be getting those games in the upcoming days, but I want to give my preview. I want to explain how these two teams, in each of these series play against each other, how they match up specifically against each other, and what to expect, at least coming from my perspective. Of course, if you want more opinions on these teams in general, you can both check out the quarterfinals preview and predictions video that went up at the beginning of the knockout stage, or you can check out any of my recaps that I did for all of the first 4 quarterfinals series. Of course, I've covered every game at Worlds so far on this channel in depth. You can check all of that out in the Worlds 2022 playlist. That's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. But let's go ahead and jump right into our analysis for the 2 series that we're going to be getting in the semifinals. Of course, only 4 teams remain here at Worlds in 2022, so it's now or never. It's only the best. We're going to be going through both of the series, analyzing each matchup in each lane for both of the series, see which teams have strengths, which teams have weaknesses in certain areas, and then I'll go ahead and give my preview and expectation for how the series is going to go. Of course, that means we're going to kick it off with the top half of the bracket here, which means that we're going to start with the number 1 seed from the LPL in Gen.G Gaming, taking on the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1. Pretty interesting matchup here, one that I'm actually really excited to get. This is probably the matchup I wanted to see the most at Worlds, mostly because there aren't really a lot of teams that like playing around topside this year, just generally around the world in any region. Topside has kind of been the weak side for pretty much every great team all year long, but Gen.G and T1 definitely buck that trend. These are the 2 best top laners in the world, and they're going into each other in this matchup. Super duper fun to preview and super fun to talk about. Let's go ahead and talk about the rosters, though. On Gen.G Gaming side, of course, you've got 369 in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Yagao in the mid lane, Hope at AD carry, and Missing at support. And then for T1, you've got Zeus in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. 2 very interesting rosters you'll note on the screen right now. Not only are you seeing all the players, obviously, you're seeing their KDAs throughout Worlds so far, and you're also seeing where I personally rank them out of the final 4 in their position. So in the top lane's case, I have Zeus as the number 1 top remaining. I have 369 as the number 2 top laner remaining. So that kind of gives you an idea of where these players lie. Now, don't take this too super seriously, because you can look like a player like Faker, and I have him listed as the 4th mid left, the worst mid left at the tournament. And while I do agree with that, it's hard for me to really believe that he will play like that. And also, he's a top 6 or 7 player left at Worlds. It's unfortunate that all of the teams left have superstar mid laners, and so it's just very difficult for me to, rank Faker higher. Theoretically, and I'll talk about this when we get to the Yagao matchup, he could be number 3, depending on, which Yagao shows up, but this is just my projections. Of course, at the end of the day, this is all my projections. But let's go ahead and jump into the preview for these 2 teams matching up against each other. Obviously, very interesting to see these 2 matched up here. Not really too surprised to see either of them in the semifinals. Both of them were top 4 teams going into the tournament, in my opinion, even though that was a relatively controversial opinion. I know some people were a lot lower on T1 than I was. I was very high on this team because I was high generally on the LCK going into Worlds this year. That turned out to be a pretty good call. Gen.G Gaming I had as the number 2 team at the tournament, and so definitely not surprised to see them in the semifinals, but definitely an interesting matchup. Like I said, not a lot of teams really playing around topside, but these 2 very much enjoy it. 369 and Zeus kind of are the best players on their respective teams. Now, for Gen.G Gaming, that might not necessarily be true, because you arguably have the best jungler in the world here in Kanavi, and that's definitely going to help you overall. But really, I think in terms of laning prowess, in terms of side of the map that you want to dominate, both of these teams have pretty consistently wanted to play towards topside. Now, ironically, it's actually been T1 that has wanted to play for topside less, And that's mostly because while I do think 369 is a good player, the reason that he ranks slightly below Zeus, and at this point, by the way, we're splitting hairs, right? These are the two best top laners in the world by a considerable margin. It's Zeus 369, and then a big gap, and then someone else, right? Like, I'm not trying to say that, you know, they're not incredibly close, but the reason I have Zeus at number 1 over 369 is I think Zeus is a much better weak side player than someone like 369 is. He can play weak side, and he's relatively okay at it on the side of 369, but you definitely prefer him to be the strong side of the map, and honestly, Gen.G has really benefited from him being strong side of the map all year long. Hope is not a strong side AD carry. He really hasn't been all year. Yagao is certainly not a strong side mid laner. You're not going to want to pump a ton of resources into that lane. You want to get him moving. You want to get him helping out the rest of his team. And so it's really been on 369 to be the power lane. And I think for T1, while Zeus is their best player, and I definitely will stick by that pretty heavily, they have a lot of lanes that they can really impact. Faker's obviously really, really good with resources if they just want to focus on that jungle mid matchup. Really pump into him. Try to get Yagao to be forced to stay in that lane because Faker is too much of a problem. Essentially bring the fight to him. And then Guma and Keria were phenomenal in the quarterfinals match against RNG in the series just in general. And Guma in general has been phenomenal at this tournament. I really want to give him a big shout out for that. I currently have him listed as the number 2 AD carry left at this tournament. That is above Deft, which I think some people are going to be a little bit, I don't know, confused, frustrated, upset by. I believe it. I think Guma's better than Deft right now, and he certainly has been playing like it. I said in my quarterfinals review of T1 versus RNG that Guma is playing like a top 3 AD carry in the world right now, and I stand by that. I think if he continues to play the way that he is, not only in lane, where he really is being able to generate leads super consistently for his team, but also in the late game, in the back half of these team fights, where his positioning has been nearly perfect on either early game, you know, dominant champions, things like the Lucian that don't really have the range to be able to dominate late game, but he still can make sure that he does a ton of damage. Or something like the Aphelios, who does have a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to play it early, and of course, being Aphelios late game. If you get that ultimate off, your auto attacker is still going to do a billion damages if you have like white, red, or whatever, you know, gun combo, white and anything basically by the end of the game. But Guma just looks really, really good right now. If he can continue his form, if he can continue to be where he was going into this series, you know, where he was in the quarterfinals, where he was in group stage, T1's actually going to be in a pretty interesting spot here, and it's going to make the game a lot more interesting. I really do think that this matchup, in general, is going to be splitting the map a bit for Gen.G and T1, because I think they have advantages in a lot of different locations. Gen.G, I think their biggest advantage is going to come from the jungle position, and this is really where I think Gen.G stands out and why I still think they're one of the best teams in the world, because, like it or not, Kanavi is just unbeatable in the early game. Like that's it. That's his game plan. He knows how to generate leads. He knows his pathing super duper well, and he's able to exploit the positioning and macro mistakes that other enemy teams make early. And T1's actually not a team that doesn't make mistakes. They are a team that is going to make a few mistakes in the early game, clean it up around the mid game, and then have a super secure late game. That's kind of been T1's MO all year. Gen.G and Kanavi most especially are actually relatively well equipped to be able to take advantage of that weakness. Gen.G does a great job being able to generate leads in the early game. Not super consistently, at least in the early game, but Kanavi definitely is able to generate leads in the early game. Like I said, he's the best pather in the world. That's really the big difference between Kanavi, in my opinion, and a lot of other junglers, and I think that is going to give JD Gaming a relative strong side of the map. Unfortunately, I do think that's going to bleed over into top lane for T1 as well, where I think 369 is often going to have a ton of prio over Zeus, at least in the early game, because Kanavi does like to spend a ton of time topside, and while Owner does generally like to spend some time topside, I think Gen.G is just going to be more willing to invest into that lane. So when you're talking about topside, I think Gen.G is actually going to have the advantage there, at least in terms of lane prio in the early game. I do think that flips a bit on the bot side, though. In my opinion, and I know a lot of people have disagreed with this in the comment section, Guma is just simply a better version of Hope. And so I don't expect to see this go any other way than T1 being stronger on the bot side. And I could see an adaptation coming out from T1 side where they just say, okay, well, top laners are just kind of going to be what they are. Zeus is good enough to play on that weak side if we need him to. And Kanavi's going to be investing a ton in the 369 like he has all year long. Let's go ahead and make sure that our bot lane is in a really good spot here. Let's get Guma something like the Lucian Nami early, or perhaps even something like the Aphelios, and then just invest into him super, super heavily so that he can get online. We're going to trust that Zeus is still going to be the best top laner in the world in teamfights like he has been pretty much the entirety of the year, and Faker's also a great team fighter. if we can invest into that bot lane, maybe the tide of that series will switch in that respect. I could definitely see that being T1's game plan, and honestly, from my perspective, that would probably be the game plan I would start off with in this series, and I certainly think that can make for an interesting matchup as JDG kind of dominates the top side, T1 kind of dominates the bot side, where I do think Guma and Keria are a better bot lane than Hope and Missing. I have Keria as the best support left, although I don't think he's like leaps and bounds better than Missing. I think they're very comparable, but Keria is just slightly better in my opinion. Like I said, I think Guma's just a better player than Hope by a considerable margin. I don't think, I've always been a little bit lower on Hope, just generally speaking. I think he's a pretty good weak side bot laner, but he certainly hasn't shown that he can be the carry for a team in the semifinals, and that might be a little bit of a problem for JDG in a bot lane focused meta. So it'll be interesting there, but at the same time, Kanavi and 369 should be able to get the better of the top two if you go for jungle top as like a duo, which I think both of these teams have really liked to do. And mostly that is not because 369 is just better than Zeus, but mostly because I think the weakest member of those four players is probably Owner. And while Owner is a pretty good player that can definitely step up, I just don't think he's on the same level of a player like Kanavi, and I would expect him to be able to generate that lead there. So that kind of leaves Yagao versus Faker as kind of the interesting matchup here that I think could really swing the direction of the series. Both players have definitely taken more of a supportive role overall this year. Yagao especially been playing a lot of Talia, a lot of Silas, a lot of shove and roamers. That's really been the play style for JD Gaming, and it's really worked for them. Kanavi generates so much pressure in the jungle and allows his laners to be pushed up so far because he can offer so much assistance that Yagao does a really good job of being able to push that advantage, shove into tower, roam with Kanavi, make plays bot lane, mostly make plays top lane. Those 3v3s top lane, very, very difficult to deal with. Not only that, but secure basically every objective. JDG has some of the best objective control in the entire world, if not the best by itself. They've just been so phenomenal at being able to secure it, and honestly, and this is a little bit of a skill as well, knowing when to give up objectives to trade for towers, to trade for, trading Dragon for Rift Herald. They know exactly when they can trade in order to get an advantage in those instances, and so Kanavi and Yagao, I think, have been absolutely huge for that, but Faker as well has kind of been exploding recently on those more supportive picks. I was really expecting to see him play some more aggressive stuff by the time he got to Worlds, but he's kind of continuing the trend that he played throughout pretty much the entirety of Summer Split, which is these more passive picks. Things like the Lissandra definitely come to mind as something that Faker has really been favorable of, but just picks of that nature, not something that's going to be able to dominate. He's not really been an Azir player over the course of the year, although obviously we know he can play it, but more control mage style. I think the most aggressive that he's gone relatively consistently has been the Victor pick, but even then, Victor's a really good secondary carry. He's not necessarily going to be picked to be your primary guy. I think Faker wants to be able to generate a lead, but he's also going to want to make sure that he's there for a lot of these objective fights. If he can generate a situation in which he can stop Yagao from roaming a ton, I think that's going to be hugely positive for T1. So that mid lane matchup, I do think, is going to be incredibly interesting and probably will matter a lot in the grand scheme of things. So where exactly do I think these two teams end up facing each other? Well, while I do think that it is interesting to see a split map focus, I'm actually going to go against the grain and stick with my original pick here. I'm going to pick JD Gaming to win this series. I looked on the Pick'ems website. I did my Pick'ems. Reminder to do your Pick'ems. That T1's super favored in this. I think they, like 85 to 90% of people in the Pick'ems have picked T1 so far. That's very surprising to me. I'm going to go with JD Gaming in this one. I think it'll be a super fun series, but I think Kanavi really is the difference maker for me. I think he's the best player in this series, and I think that is going to show up on the Rift. I think jungle as a position is probably the one with the biggest impact in the game right now, and while I do think bot is a close second, I think jungle is ridiculously important in this series, and I think the difference between Kanavi and Owner is just simply too big for me to not see JD Gaming as favored in this series. I think T1's best player is ironically matched by another one of the best players in the world. Usually they can kind of rely on that top side to be able to generate a lead without a ton of investment. I'm not sure 369 is going to be the matchup that you're going to be able to generate that lead in by yourself, and so definitely a little bit interesting on that regard. I do think your bot lane is definitely a strength right now and could be a strength in this series, but Hope and Missing certainly aren't bad players. They're not a bot lane that are going to get completely run over even by really, really good bot lanes, and so I don't expect Guma and Keria to be able to generate a ridiculous lead, especially if Kanavi is offering any sort of resistance in that bot side, and Yagao just does his role so well. I think him and Faker are both going to be very relevant, but I think that is only going to favor JDG in my opinion. But if I had to guess, yeah, JDG in I'm going to say JDG in 5 or T1 in 5. That's my 2-game spread. While I am on the side of JDG. If T1 won this series, I certainly wouldn't be entirely surprised. I'm just going to pick JDG because I do think that the consistency of that team is just a tad bit higher. And I think the difference of having the best jungler in the world and just a very, 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 very good jungler is going to show itself in this series. Moving on to our second semifinal series here, as we have an LCK Civil War here. We're going to guarantee at least one LCK team in semifinals because we have the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G taking on the number 4 seed from the LCK in DRX. Now, one of these teams, no one is surprised to see here. The other, I think a lot of people are surprised to see here. Maybe not in terms of recent form, but just in terms of overall. Nobody went into this tournament expecting DRX to make the top 4 to the semifinals here, and you just got to feel happy for them to even be here. Certain players have really stepped up throughout the tournament so far, and that's kind of reflected in the rankings, but at the end of the day, Gen.G is kind of scary, so let's go ahead and talk about where I think some advantages may lie for DRX overall. Might give them a shot against a team like Gen.G, because I'm not going to go into this with the pretense that this matchup is even in any sense. I don't think anybody's going to be going into this with the expectation that it's going to be even, but I do believe that there are avenues that DRX can exploit. So let's talk about each team individually for a second here. Gen.G obviously has been carried relatively just based off of their ridiculous talent. They are the most talented team in the world, and it's not all that close. Peanut, Chovy, Ruler, I've talked about this relatively consistently as a trio, is the best trio that League of Legends has maybe ever seen. One of the best, at least the best right now. It's not one of the best right now. It's the best trio in the world right now. But just talent-wise, I don't think you're going to be able to find a lot of teams that have that level of talent consistently through jungle, mid, and AD carry, the 3 most important positions in the game right now. Yes, I think support is also very integral and very important, but you need those 3 spots. Those are the 3 spots that are going to carry you to a World Finals, and luckily for Gen.G, that's where their strengths are, and even their quote-unquote weaknesses are not weaknesses at all. Lehens, I have him as the number 3 support left. Some people are going to have him as the number 1 support left. Some people have him above Keria and Missing, and honestly, I understand it. His flash performances, the best that you get out of Lehens is better than the best that you get out of Keria, and the best that you get out of Missing. My hang-up with Lehens has always been the games that he's not at his best on, and those are not particularly great. He's just kind of an inconsistent star, right? So he's still a very good player, and he's in the semifinals for a reason, but, you know, definitely not the most consistent player overall. Ruler definitely helps, I would say, with this consistency. And then you've got Doran in the top lane, who, he's a good player. He's not a superstar, but he's a good top laner. He's certainly not a bad player by any means. He's been weak side for this team for a majority of the year, but we've seen him be able to pull out things like the Camille, things like the Jace that have definitely been staple picks of his when he was younger, when he was more of an aggressive top laner. I definitely think that could come out a bit more in this series, because I do think there is, you know, kind of a gaping hole in DRX's plan, which is the top side of the map, and I think generally speaking, you can probably invest into Doran a tad bit more here and maybe exploit it just a bit, but Doran and Lehens, if they're your 2 weakest players, I mean, that is a ridiculously strong core, and so that's kind of, you know, been the MO of Gen.G getting here. They started out the tournament a little bit slow, losing that game to RNG, not really looking super dominant in wins over like 100 Thieves or CFO. And so for them to come out and just have this banger of a series against one of the other best teams in the world in Damwon and be able to win that in 5 games, they almost get reverse swept, but for them to be able to win game 5 in a fantastic end, Ruler to be able to be awesome in that series, Chovy as well. Want to give a huge shout out to those two. Chovy and Ruler were fantastic throughout the course of that series, and for them to hit the semifinals here, they've got to be feeling super confident moving in. They look a lot better, I think, as a team, generally speaking, right now, and they should be going into this with all the confidence in the world. DRX, on the other side, also should be going into this with all the confidence in the world, because we just talked about Gen.G almost getting reverse swept. DRX officially completes the reverse sweep on EDG in the quarterfinals to be able to make it here. Their team is a little bit different, though. They've really relied on a particular game plan to be able to get them into this spot here in the semifinals, and that's dominating these skirmish-heavy comps, and that's really a beneficial style, I would say, overall, because you can kind of reflect that onto anybody in the world. If you can generally win skirmishes against teams, you're going to be able to do that pretty successfully. There aren't a lot of teams that are just going to be able to stop skirmishes, because it's just kind of hard if you're good at it. And of course, if we're talking about DRX, we've got to talk about Zika. I don't really think there's a huge argument to be made that he is not the best player at Worlds so far. He is the best player at Worlds. Like, and it hasn't been all that close. He has dominated every single player that he's come up against. He's had some, like, 1 or 2 iffy games, but compare that to the fact that he's played more games than almost anybody at the tournament. And the fact that he's dominated every single stage. He was the best player in play-ins. He was the best player in groups. You could argue he was the best player in the quarterfinals. Like, he has just been unstoppable at the tournament so far. I have him as the number 2 mid. I do have him below Chovy because at the end of the day, it still is Chovy. But if there's any mid laner who's in form enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with Chovy in carrying games, as well as potentially even surpass him, right now it is Zika in the mid lane for DRX, and it's really, really been fun to see him emerge, but this team is going to need more than just him to be able to step up if they want to be able to win at the tournament here. They're going to need Deft to really show up. He played great in the quarterfinals. They're going to need quarterfinals Deft and not summer split Deft. I know a lot of people were really high on Deft coming out of the summer split, and while, yes, I do think he was a good player, I talked about this in my DRX preview, I think Deft was the model, the example of consistency, right? In the sense of he never lost lane in the LCK. He was never a problem, but he was never necessarily this driving force that was going to be up 30 CS and up 3 kills and really carrying the team on his back to a win. He was just going to be neutral in every game, and I think that is super valuable, especially going into a bot lane like Ruler and Lehens that are generally able to generate such strong leads, but Deft's not the player that's going to be able to generate a ridiculous amount of advantages. Now, I will say a lot of that is because this team very rarely invests into their bot lane in the early game. Pyosik, for one reason or another, just doesn't go bot lane with a lot of his ganks, and you can say that's good or bad, but Zika and Deft have definitely been the 2 major carries, I would say, in the late game for DRX. They're going to have to step up and be just as good, if not better, than their counterparts on the side of Gen.G and Chovy and Ruler in order for DRX to have a chance in this series. You do have some kind of weak points on this team. I don't want to just sit here and call them that, but let's talk about the top side first. Kingen and Pyosik as your top jungle duo. Definitely interesting as a duo, I would say overall. Kingen had his best year in the LCK, in my opinion, in 2022. Took a big step up over being a major hindrance towards DRX last year. I think he was a lot better as a weak side top. This year, he was even given some resources at certain parts of this year. Pyosik does like to go top lane relatively consistently, and so Kingen's actually given quite a bit of leeway to be able to push his advantage. Now, that doesn't mean he's the strongest player overall. I still have him weaker than Doran, and I do have him as the weakest top laner left in the semis by a considerable margin. I think that is an area that you could exploit on the side of Gen.G, which is what I was talking about with maybe putting Doran on some more aggressive picks, but Kingen can get resources and he can do well. This is somebody who I think is probably more efficient on tanks, but has shown the ability to play fighters and more aggressive picks a little bit more heavily. Then you've got Pyosik in the jungle. Now, it's hard to talk about Pyosik because he's either PO sick or he's PO shit. Those are the 2 versions of him that you are going to get. He has been very good, I would say, throughout Worlds so far, at least most of the time. He certainly hasn't been perfect through all the games. He's definitely showed up more in some than he has in others, but if you're getting a good version of Pyosik, he's someone who can go toe-to-toe with a player like Peanut. Peanut does play a relatively passive style in the early game, at least right now. He's done relatively consistently with that. He is someone who is able to be taken advantage of, like we saw in the series against Damwon, with Canyon being able to really out-jungle Peanut in the early game. For Pyosik to be able to do that, I think that's not a major stretch to be able to make, but for Pyosik to be able to maintain that lead against a player like Peanut, who does a fantastic job of playing from behind. He's probably the single best jungler in the world at playing from a losing advantage or a losing angle, which is incredibly valuable. There aren't a lot of junglers in the world that play well when they're super behind in gold, but Peanut is by far the best at that, in my opinion. Pyosik just needs to be able to sustain that lead throughout the entirety of the game. He is prone to 1 or 2 major mistakes per game, but if you're getting the good version of Pyosik, this could be an interesting series. That does bring us to Beryl in the support position, and in my opinion, he's been the worst player on DRX all year long, and I think that is absolutely continued here at Worlds. He was a hindrance, I would say, at the beginning of the EDG series, to say the least. His 2 games of Heimer to start off that series were not good at all. His macro decisions have just been bad. One of the things that I always praised Beryl for on Damwon was the fact that he really had great timers for when he needed to leave lane, when Ghost was okay to be able to be abandoned, and when he could go and roam with Canyon and try to make plays around the map. That was what made Damwon so dangerous to have to deal with, is it always felt like they had a man up in all these team fights, but the opposite has been the case for DRX so far this year. Beryl and Pyosik seemingly have absolutely zero chemistry together and just aren't on the same page pretty much ever. When Beryl goes to roam, when Beryl goes to do this, it really accomplishes nothing. He often leaves lane at very poor times and leaves Deft to be in really bad situations basically by himself. And Gen.G really is a team that can take advantage of that, Like, there are a lot of teams out there that I think of like, oh, okay, you know, in the 1v2, they're gonna, you know, push in and shove in, and Deft's gonna be able to lose a little bit of farm, but he's gonna be fine. Lehens is not the player that is going to not take advantage of Deft being alone at an improper time. He's going to try and catch out players like Deft and Beryl when they're in bad spots, and Ruler and Peanut are usually in great spots to be able to follow up with that. So I would expect that to maybe be a big problem for DRX, but it'll be interesting to see. Beryl might be the biggest thing I'm worried about on the side of DRX for the series. But what do I think is going to happen overall? Well, like I said, Gen.G is the favorite going into this for a reason, and I'm going to continue to pick Gen.G. I do think DRX should be able to win one game here. Zika is just simply too good to not win one game in the semifinals, but there's just a huge talent gap, in my opinion, between Gen.G and DRX, and I just don't think it's going to be surmountable. On the side of DRX, they're going to be happy to have made this spot in the first place, but I do think the miracle run for Deft comes to an end here. So I've got Gen.G winning in a 3-0 or a 3-1. That's my two-game spread here, and they definitely should be considered favorites going into this. If DRX pull out some sort of miracle, though, I think a lot of people are going to see this team as unstoppable going into the finals when it comes to luck and when it comes to fate. Alright, well that is going to do it for my Worlds 2022 semifinals overview and predictions for both series, JDG T1, Gen.G DRX. We now have previews and predictions for that. I've got JDG and Gen.G moving into the finals, which is what I had originally. I don't think I saw enough in the quarterfinals to change my mind on that, although JDG T1 should be an absolute banger of a series, and I'm super excited to see how that goes down. Gen.G DRX should be fun as well, but Gen.G should have a pretty massive talent gap, so I would expect them to win that. But of course, let me know how you guys feel down in the comment section below. Do you agree with my takes? Do you think T1's going to be JDG? Do you think DRX is going to be Gen.G? Of course, let me know that down in the comment section below. Let me know how you think these series are going to go, and let me know how you have been enjoying Worlds so far. We've had a lot of really, really fun series, obviously. Gen.G Damwon, DRX ADG were bangers in the quarterfinals. Hopefully we can get some other bangers here as we move throughout the semis. And of course, leave a like on the video as well. We put a ton of time and effort into making these videos, not only this one, but of course, recaps of every single series, every single game so far at Worlds, and all these previews and stuff. So go ahead and leave a like if you did enjoy it. It really does help the channel out a lot, and it means a lot to me to let me know that you guys are enjoying the content. Of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. We're going to be going over these series as they happen throughout the next couple of days. We're going to be overviewing every single game and how these teams are looking, and then of course, we're going to be previewing and going over the finals as well. Of course, we'll also be doing some off-season content when that really starts rolling out. We've been getting a ton of rumors already, so the off-season we know is going to be an absolute blast. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, we're going to be covering that as soon as Worlds ends as well. So hit that subscribe button if you're new and hit the bell so you can see when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.